The granite headstone was cold against my fingertips, even in the Nashville heat. Anna Marie Carter, forever in our hearts, September 15th, 1973. Just 11 words to mark a life that lasted only minutes. I knelt beside the small grave, my arthritic knees protesting against the unforgiving ground. 45 years today, baby girl, I whispered to the morning stillness. 45 years since you tried to come into this world, and my voice caught. Even now, at 68, with silver hair and a lifetime of healing behind me, the words still came hard. A mockingbird called from the old oak tree, above its song piercing the humid air. I closed my eyes and let myself remember, not the sanitized version I'd told the world for decades, but the truth. The whole terrible, magnificent truth of how Mary Ellen Murphy became Dr. Mary Ellen Carter, how a broken girl from East Nashville transformed her deepest trauma into a mission that would save thousands of lives. But to understand that transformation, you need to know where it all began. In a cramped house on Woodland Street, where fear lived in every corner and silence was survival. I was born in 1956 into a world where women were expected to shrink themselves small. My father disappeared before I drew my first breath, a shadow of a man whose absence shaped my childhood more than his presence ever could have. When people asked about him, my mother Constance would simply say, "Some men ain't built for staying," and change the subject with the finality of a slammed door. What we had instead of a father was my grandfather, Anthony Murphy. Mr. Anthony, to everyone, including his own family. He was a wiry man with calloused hands and eyes like chips of flint, who carried the weight of the depression in his bones and the cruelty of his own father in his heart. He worked construction when there was work to be had, and when there wasn't, he drank whiskey and reminded us daily that we lived under his roof by his grace. The house told the story of our hierarchy. Mr. Anthony claimed the largest bedroom at the front, with its single window facing the street where he could watch the comings and goings of neighbors. My mother and I shared the middle room, sleeping in a bed that creaked with every movement. The back room was his domain. Tools, tobacco tins, and bottles hidden behind old furniture. None of us dared enter without permission. "Education's wasted on females," he declared when I finished 4th grade. "Time you learned something useful." My mother's protest died in her throat when his hand cracked across her cheek. The sound echoed in our small kitchen like a gunshot. She never brought up my schooling again. So at 10 years old, while other children learned about presidents and fractions, I learned to cook cornbread that wouldn't crumble to get bloodstains out of work shirts, to make myself invisible when his footsteps grew heavy on the porch. By 14, I could run a household with the efficiency of a woman twice my age. "You're getting accomplished," Mr. Anthony would say, nodding approval as I served his supper. "Soon you'll be ready for a husband. Get you out of my house for good." Freedom. The word tasted sweeter than honey on my tongue. Every night, I'd lie in that creaking bed and dream of escape, of a small house where I could speak without permission, where laughter wouldn't be met with suspicion, where love might grow in soil that hadn't been poisoned by rage. That dream walked into my life on a June evening in 1972, wearing a blue shirt and a smile that could light up downtown Nashville. The St. John's Festival was the one night a year when our neighborhood came alive with music and possibility. Paper lanterns strung between the houses, the smell of barbecue mixing with honeysuckle, and young people dancing on makeshift plywood floors. I was 16, wearing my one good dress, a pale yellow thing my mother had sewn from fabric she'd saved for months to buy. "You look like sunshine," a voice said behind me. I turned and found myself face to face with the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. Not handsome in the rugged way of the construction workers I knew, but beautiful in the way of movie stars. Gentle brown eyes, dark hair that fell across his forehead, and that smile that seemed to hold all the warmth missing from my life. "I'm Joe Carter," he said, extending his hand. "And you're the prettiest girl at this whole festival." My cheeks burned. "Mary Ellen Murphy." "Mary Ellen," he repeated like he was testing how my name felt in his mouth. "Would you like to dance, Mary Ellen Murphy?" For the first time in my 16 years, I felt what it meant to be chosen. Not assigned duties or given orders, but chosen. His hand was warm in mine as he led me to the dancing area where couples swayed to a country ballad played by a three-piece band. "You're not from around here," I said as we moved together, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could feel it. "Grew up in Berry Hill," he said. "Work at Morrison's fabric store downtown. Been saving up to get my own place." He paused, studying my face in the lantern light. "What about you? What are your dreams?" Mary Ellen Murphy. Dreams. No one had ever asked me about dreams before. I started, then stopped. How could I tell him about the ache for freedom for a life where every word wasn't weighed and measured for potential offense? "I want a family," I said finally. "Children who laugh without looking over their shoulders. A husband who comes home gentle." Something shifted in his expression. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. "More than anything." We danced until the band packed up their instruments, and when he walked me to my door, my grandfather was waiting on the porch, a cigarette glowing like an angry eye in the darkness. "Boy!" Mr. Anthony's voice cut through the night air. "This is my granddaughter. You best remember that." Joe straightened beside me, but his voice remained respectful. "Yes, sir. I'm Joe Carter. I work at Morrison's downtown. I know who you are." My grandfather's eyes never left Joe's face. "Question is what you want with my girl." "I'd like to see her again, sir, with your permission." Mr. Anthony took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember illuminating his weathered features. "We'll see about that." That night, lying in bed while my mother pretended to sleep beside me, I replayed every moment. The way Joe's hand felt in mine. The sound of his laugh. The gentle way he'd looked at me when I talked about wanting children. For 3 months, we courted in secret. Joe would find reasons to walk past the grocery store where I shopped, slipping me notes between the canned goods. We'd meet at the community center during my errands, stealing precious minutes in the church pew during Wednesday evening services. My mother knew. I could see it in her knowing looks. But she said nothing, understanding perhaps that some dreams were too fragile to survive my grandfather's scrutiny. But secrets have a way of growing too large to contain. It was my mother who finally broke. Not from spite, but from hope. She'd found one of Joe's notes in my apron pocket. A simple thing that said, "Counting the hours until I see your smile again." And something in those words must have awakened the girl she'd once been. "That Carter boy's been asking around," she told Mr. Anthony over Sunday supper. "Asking about Mary Ellen." I felt the blood drain from my face. Across the table, my grandfather's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Has he now?" His voice was deceptively calm. "And what's he been asking?" "About her character, her family, the kinds of questions a serious young man asks." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, Mr. Anthony set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "Bring him by tomorrow. If he's got something to say, he can say it to my face." That evening was the longest of my life. Joe arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing his Sunday best and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. His hands shook slightly as he handed them to me, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Mr. Murphy, I'd like to ask for your granddaughter's hand in marriage." The explosion I expected didn't come. Instead, my grandfather studied Joe with the calculating look of a man sizing up livestock. "You got work?" "Yes, sir. Morrison's fabric store. Been there 2 years. "Make enough to support a wife?" "I believe so, sir. I've been saving. Got my eye on a little house in Berry Hill." "You believe?" Mr. Anthony's voice sharpened. Boy belief, don't put food on the table or keep the lights burning. My granddaughter's been raised proper. She ain't gonna live in poverty because some young fool's got stars in his eyes. Daddy, my mother's voice cut through the tension. The boy's trying to do right. Stay out of this, Constance. No. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. My mother stood up, her hands pressed flat against the table. I won't stay out of this. Mary Ellen's 16 years old. She's got a right to her own life. She's got what I say she's got. She's not your property. The strength in my mother's voice surprised us all. She's a good girl who found a good man, and if you can't see that, then you're blind as well as cruel. The slap echoed through the house. My mother's head snapped to the side, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she straightened, touching her reddening cheek, and looked my grandfather square in the eye. Hit me all you want, she said quietly. But Mary Ellen's going to marry this boy if she wants to. I won't let you steal her chance like... She didn't finish the sentence, but we all heard the ending. Like you stole mine. The wedding was small, just a civil ceremony at the courthouse with my mother as witness and Joe's best friend Tommy standing up for him. Mr. Anthony refused to attend, declaring that he'd washed his hands of the whole affair. But as Joe slipped the thin gold band onto my finger, I felt like the richest woman in Tennessee. Our house in Berry Hill was tiny. 2 rooms and a bathroom that had been added as an afterthought. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, and the bedroom could fit our bed and a small dresser with inches to spare. But it was ours. Those first months felt like living in a dream. I could wake up without tiptoeing, speak without measuring my words, laugh without fear of consequence. Joe would leave for work with a kiss and return each evening with stories from the store and sometimes a small treat. A piece of candy, a flower from someone's garden, once a book of poetry he'd bought from a street vendor. Read to me, he'd say after supper, and I'd stumble through the verses while he listened with the attention of a man hearing scripture. It was during one of those quiet evenings in November that I first felt the wave of nausea that would change everything. By December, there was no denying it. I was carrying a baby. A baby. Joe breathed when I told him, his face transforming with wonder. He picked me up and spun me around our tiny kitchen, both of us laughing with pure joy. Mary Ellen, we're going to have a baby. We spent winter evenings making plans. Joe would ask Mr. Morrison for a raise. We'd save every penny for baby clothes and a crib. If it was a boy, we'd call him Joe Jr. If it was a girl, Anna Marie, after Joe's mother, who died when he was 12. Anna Marie Carter. I'd whisper to my growing belly. What do you think of that little one? And she'd respond with kicks and tumbles that made me laugh out loud, this tiny person already making her presence known. I'd never been so happy. The fear and constraint of my childhood felt like someone else's life, a dark story I'd heard once, but could barely remember. But happiness, I learned, can make you careless. Make you forget that some people view joy as a threat. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon in March. I was 7 months along my belly round and tight, feeling Anna Marie's restless movements as she seemed to sense the approaching spring. Joe had gone to the hardware store, leaving me to rest with my feet up and a cup of tea growing cold on the side table. Through the window, I saw my grandfather's familiar silhouette on the porch. My blood turned to ice. I considered not answering, pretending I wasn't home. But his voice boomed through the thin door. Open up, Mary Ellen. I know you're in there. With effort, I pulled myself upright and walked to the door. When I opened it, the smell of whiskey hit me like a slap. It was barely 2 in the afternoon. Afternoon, Grandpa. Joe's not here if you're looking for him. I'm looking for you. He pushed past me into the living room, his eyes taking in the baby clothes I'd been folding, the crib Joe had assembled in the corner. Look at this mess. Playing house with babies you can't afford. We're managing just fine. Are you... He turned those flint chip eyes on me. Boy barely makes $20 a week. You think that's going to stretch to feed and clothe a baby? Pay doctor bills? Handle emergencies? Joe's getting a raise soon, and I can take in sewing. Sewing? He laughed a sound like gravel in a tin can. Girl, you got no idea what's coming. Babies cost money, real money. And when that $20 a week ain't enough, and it won't be, where you gonna turn? I knew where he was heading, and my hands instinctively moved to protect my belly. We won't need help from you. Course you will. They always do. And then you'll come crawling back to my house with your husband and your squalling baby expecting me to feed all three of you. He moved closer, and I could see the broken blood vessels in his nose, the yellow tinge to his eyes. I already raised you and your mother. I ain't raising grandchildren too. You won't have to. We're doing fine on our own. For now, he said. But there's still time to fix this. I know women who handle these situations, midwives who know how to solve problems before they get too big to handle. The words hit me like a physical blow. Get out! Now you listen to me, girl? Get out! The scream tore from my throat with such force that Anna Marie jerked inside me, startled by the violence of it. Get out of my house right now! His face darkened. You ungrateful little bitch. Don't come crying to me when that husband of yours can't put food on the table. Don't come begging when you're living in the streets with a baby on your hip. He stalked toward the door, then turned back. And don't think you can hide behind that boy forever. Some lessons got to be learned the hard way. The threat hung in the air long after he'd slammed the door behind him. I sank onto the couch, my whole body shaking, Anna Marie rolling restlessly as if she could sense my distress. When Joe came home an hour later, he found me still sitting there staring at the door. Mary, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I told him everything. Watched his face change from confusion to understanding to something harder and more dangerous than I'd ever seen there. He what? Joe's voice was deadly quiet. He suggested that you get rid of... He's just trying to scare us. No. Joe paced to the window, his hands clenched into fists. This isn't about money, Mary. This is about control. About punishing you for getting away from him. What do you mean? Joe turned back to me, and in his eyes, I saw a man making calculations, weighing options. Your grandfather's not worried about having to support us. He's angry that you're happy, that you found something he couldn't give you or take away. The truth of it settled into my bones like cold water. Of course, Mr. Anthony had never been able to bear anyone else's joy. My mother's brief happiness with my father, crushed. Her dreams of education for me, destroyed. And now my marriage, my pregnancy, my hope for a different kind of life. All of it was an affront to his need to control. What do we do? I asked. Joe knelt beside the couch and took my hands in his. We protect our family, whatever it takes. I should have seen the resolve hardening in his eyes. Should have recognized the same quality I'd seen in my mother when she stood up to Mr. Anthony about my marriage. But I was focused on the life growing inside me, on the dreams we'd built together, on the naive belief that love could shield us from the worst intentions of cruel people. Spring arrived early that year. By April, Nashville was already drowning in humidity and the promise of a long, hot summer. I was 8 months pregnant and miserable. My back ached constantly. My feet were so swollen I could only wear one pair of shoes, and Anna Marie seemed determined to use my ribs as her personal playground. Joe had been working longer hours, taking on extra shifts at the store. Saving for the baby, he'd say when I asked, but there was something in his manner that made me uneasy. He'd become secretive, protective in a way that felt more like walls than safety. On September 14th, the air hung thick and still pregnant with the threat of thunderstorms. I'd spent the day restless and uncomfortable, unable to find a position that gave me any relief. Anna Marie was unusually active, rolling and stretching, until I wondered if she was trying to rearrange my internal organs. Easy there, little girl, I murmured, rubbing the spot where what felt like an elbow was jabbing my side. "Save some energy for your grand entrance." Joe came home that evening with an odd tension in his shoulders. He kept checking the windows, and when I asked what he was looking for, he just said, "Nothing, sweetheart. Just want to make sure everything's secure." We went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Every position was uncomfortable, and Anna Marie seemed to be having a party in my womb. Around midnight, I gave up and went to the kitchen to make some chamomile tea, hoping it might calm both me and the baby. That's when I heard the first sound. Not quite a footstep, not quite a scrape, just something that didn't belong to the usual night symphony of crickets and distant traffic. Joe," I called softly, but he was deeply asleep, exhausted from his long days. I stood in the kitchen, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that pregnancy and fear were making me imagine things. But as I poured hot water over the tea bag, I heard it again. Definitely footsteps, this time slow and deliberate, circling the house. My blood turned to ice. I knew those footsteps, had memorized their rhythm during countless nights of my childhood, listening for the sound that would tell me whether Mr. Anthony was coming home drunk and angry or drunk and mean. The footsteps stopped at the front door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came the knock. Not the aggressive pounding I expected, but a soft, almost polite rapping that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of noise. I stood frozen in the kitchen tea bag, bleeding color into the hot water. Anna Marie suddenly still inside me, as if she too sensed danger. The knocking came again, patient, persistent. "Mary Ellen." My grandfather's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I know you're awake in there. Saw the light come on." I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to muffle my breathing. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd leave. Maybe this was just another attempt at intimidation. "Mary Ellen, honey, we need to talk. About the baby, about what's best for everyone." The endearment made my skin crawl. In 16 years, he'd never called me honey. "I know you're scared, girl. But there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm family. Just want to help you see reason before it's too late." I crept toward the bedroom, thinking I could wake Joe, that together we could figure out what to do. But Anna Marie chose that moment to shift position, and the movement sent a sharp pain through my side that made me gasp audibly. The knocking stopped. "There's my girl." Mr. Anthony's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Open the door, Mary Ellen. Let's settle this like civilized people." "Go away," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Joe's here. He'll call the police." A low chuckle drifted through the thin wood. "Joe's not here, girl. Saw him leave an hour ago. Got called away on some kind of emergency. Work trouble, from what I heard." My heart stopped. Joe was gone. How was that possible? He'd been sleeping right beside me. "You're lying. Check for yourself." With a hand pressed to my aching back, I made my way to the bedroom. The bed was empty, covers thrown back hastily. A note lay on Joe's pillow. "Emergency at the store. Back soon. Lock the doors. Jay." How had I not heard him leave? How long had I been alone? "Found the note, did you?" Mr. Anthony's voice was closer now, as if he'd moved to the window. Funny how these emergencies always happen at just the right time. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Joe hadn't been called away by chance. This had been planned, orchestrated. "What do you want?" I called out, backing toward the kitchen, where I remembered seeing a knife in the dish drainer. "Just to talk, to help you understand what's at stake here." His voice was maddeningly reasonable. "This baby's going to ruin your life, Mary Ellen. Ruin your husband's life, too. But it doesn't have to. There are still options." I reached the kitchen and wrapped my fingers around the knife handle. It wasn't much, just a paring knife Joe used to peel apples, but it was something. "I'm not getting rid of my baby. Baby." He laughed. "Girl that ain't a baby yet. It's a problem. A complication. And complications need solving before they get out of hand." The doorknob turned. I stared at it in horror, realizing that in my panic, I'd forgotten to lock the door after Joe left. The knob turned slowly, deliberately, and then the door swung open. Mr. Anthony stood in the doorway, backlit by the streetlight, looking like death itself come calling. But it was his eyes that terrified me most. Not angry or wild as I'd expected, but calm, purposeful, like a man who'd made peace with what he was about to do. "There's my girl," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Now let's sit down and talk about this situation like adults. Stay away from me." I held the knife out in front of me, but my hand was shaking so badly it was useless as a weapon. "Put that down before you hurt yourself." He moved into the living room, his movements unhurried. "Pregnant women shouldn't be handling sharp objects. Might have an accident." "Get out of my house! Your house." He settled into Joe's favorite chair like he owned it. "Girl, this ain't your house. This is a rented shack that boy can barely afford. Soon as that baby comes, you'll be out on the street, or back in my house, eating my food using my electricity depending on my charity." He leaned forward, and I caught the smell of whiskey mixed with something else, something medicinal and bitter. "But I'm here to offer you a different choice, a better choice." "I don't want to hear it." "Course you do, because deep down you know I'm right. You know that baby's going to be nothing but trouble. Crying all night, needing doctors, needing food and clothes and attention you can't afford to give." His voice was hypnotic, reasonable. "But it doesn't have to happen. I know people, discreet people, who can solve this problem tonight. You could wake up tomorrow and get back to your life. Your real life." "You're insane." "Am I? Or am I the only one thinking clearly?" He stood up, and I saw that he was carrying something, a small leather bag like the ones midwives used. "See, I already made arrangements, just in case you came to your senses." The knife fell from my nerveless fingers. "No." "It'll be quick. Professional. Won't hardly hurt at all." He opened the bag, revealing instruments that gleamed dully in the lamplight. "And afterward, you and Joe can go back to playing house without any complications." "Help!" I screamed as loud as I could. "Somebody help me!" "Scream all you want," he said calmly. "Mrs. Henderson's visiting her daughter in Memphis. The Johnsons went to see family in Kentucky, and the Washingtons." He smiled. "Well, they know better than to interfere in family business." He'd planned this. Every detail. Made sure we'd be alone, made sure Joe would be gone, made sure no one would come running, no matter how loud I screamed. I turned to run, but my swollen belly threw off my balance. I made it 3 steps before stumbling, catching myself against the kitchen counter. Pain shot through my abdomen, not the sharp kick of baby movement, but something deeper. "Wrong." "Easy there," Mr. Anthony said suddenly behind me. "Don't want to hurt the merchandise before we're ready." His hand clamped down on my shoulder, fingers digging in until I cried out. With his other hand, he reached for something in his bag. "This'll help you relax," he said, and I saw the glint of a needle. "Make the whole thing easier for both of us." That's when something shifted inside me. Not Anna Marie. Something in my own spirit. A kind of desperate strength I'd never known I possessed. I spun around, using my belly as a weapon, driving it into his midsection with all my weight behind it. He staggered backward, surprise flashing across his face. "You little—" I grabbed the first thing I could reach, the heavy cast-iron skillet Joe used to make cornbread, and swung it with everything I had. The sound it made, connecting with his skull, was like a melon hitting pavement. Mr. Anthony's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor, the needle flying from his hand to skitter across the linoleum. For a moment, I stood over him, the skillet still raised, waiting for him to move. But he lay perfectly still, a dark stain spreading beneath his head. I dropped the skillet and stumbled backward. Had I killed him? Was he dead? Before I could check, another pain gripped me. This one unmistakably different from anything I'd felt before. Not the baby moving, but my body contracting, trying to expel her. "No, no, no!" I whispered, sinking to my knees. "Not now, Anna Marie. Not like this." But my body had its own agenda. The stress, the terror, the physical confrontation. It was all too much. I felt wetness between my legs, and when I looked down, my nightgown was soaked with blood. Too much blood. I crawled to the phone, my vision graying at the edges, and dialed the operator with shaking fingers. "Emergency." I gasped when she answered. "I need an ambulance. I'm losing my baby." The next few hours passed in a haze of sirens and hospital lights, and doctors speaking in low, urgent voices. They tried to save her, my Anna Marie, but the placental abruption was too severe. 8 months of life of dreams of planning and hoping and loving ended in a delivery room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. "I'm sorry," Dr. Richards said, his voice gentle but final. "The trauma was too extensive. There was nothing we could do." They let me hold her afterward. All 5 pounds, 2 ounces of her. Perfect tiny fingers. Dark hair like her daddy's. Eyes that would never open to see the world we'd prepared for her. "I'm sorry, baby girl," I whispered against her still forehead. "Mama tried to protect you. I'm so sorry I failed." Joe arrived as they were taking her away. Someone had finally reached him. The emergency at the store had been nothing more than a broken window that could have waited until morning. He took one look at me lying pale and empty in the hospital bed and understood everything. "Where is he?" Joe's voice was deadly quiet. "Joe, don't." "Where is he, Mary?" I told him. About the visit, the bag of instruments, the struggle. About the cast iron skillet and the blood spreading across our kitchen floor. "Did I kill him?" I asked. "I can't remember if I checked." "He's alive," Joe said grimly. Police found him conscious when they responded to the ambulance call. He told them he came to check on you and found you collapsed. Said he must have hit his head trying to help. They believed him, easier than believing the alternative. Joe's jaw was rigid with controlled fury. Man like him, pillar of the community, versus his pregnant granddaughter with a history of emotional instability. Who do you think they'd rather believe? So that was it. Mr. Anthony would walk away free, and I would carry the weight of our daughter's death, alone. The official story would be placental abruption brought on by stress and an unfortunate fall. Family tragedy. These things happen. But Joe and I knew the truth, and as we buried Anna Marie in a tiny white casket in Elmwood Cemetery, we made a silent promise. This wouldn't end here. Not like this. The plan took shape slowly over weeks of whispered conversations and careful observation. Joe reached out to men he'd known in his wilder days, before he'd found steady work and fallen in love with a girl who dreamed of normal life. Men who understood that sometimes the law wasn't enough. That sometimes justice had to be homemade. "There's this guy," Joe said one evening as we sat in our too-quiet house surrounded by baby things we couldn't bear to put away. "Tony Bighead. He and his crew handle problems for the right price." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that keep people awake at night." Joe's eyes were hard as flint. "The kind that make sure bad men understand there are consequences." We sold everything we had of value. My mother's jewelry, Joe's father's watch, the wedding china we'd never used. It took weeks to scrape together the money Tony demanded, but eventually we had enough. The meeting was set for a Thursday night at a bar in South Nashville where the neon sign flickered and died every few minutes, and the bartender minded his own business. Tony Bighead was exactly what his name suggested, a mountain of a man with a skull like a bowling ball and scars that spoke of a life lived hard. "So," he said after Joe had explained what we wanted, "you're looking for a lesson to be taught." "A thorough lesson," I said, meeting his eyes. "The kind that sticks." And the subject of this lesson My grandfather, Anthony Murphy, lives on Woodland Street. Tony nodded slowly. I know the type. Old school, hard-headed. Probably thinks he's bulletproof. Not bulletproof, Joe said. Just protected by a system that doesn't care about women like my wife? Well, Tony grinned, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Good thing we ain't part of that system. The plan was simple. On Friday morning, Mr. Anthony would leave for work at his usual time. Tony and his crew would intercept him, take him somewhere quiet, and spend the weekend teaching him what it felt like to be helpless, powerless, afraid. How far you want us to take this? Tony asked. I thought of Anna Marie, of the instruments in that leather bag, of the needle meant to end her life before it began. As far as it takes, I said. Whatever he intended for my baby, let him feel it himself. Mary. Joe's voice carried a warning. You sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. Tony nodded. 3 days. He'll be gone 3 days. Long enough to understand that his actions have consequences. When we bring him back, he'll be different. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly. Joe and I sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee that tasted like cardboard and watching the clock. At exactly 6:45, Joe nodded toward the window. There he goes. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw my grandfather's familiar figure trudging toward the bus stop lunch pail in hand, unaware that this would be his last normal morning for a very long time. Tony was as good as his word. Mr. Anthony simply vanished. The police were notified, but missing persons cases involving middle-aged men weren't high priority, especially when there was no sign of foul play. His coworkers assumed he was sick. His neighbors figured he'd gone to visit distant relatives. Only my mother was truly worried, and she came to us looking for comfort. I can't understand it, she said, wringing her hands. He always tells me when he's going somewhere. Always leaves word. I'm sure he's fine, I said, pouring her tea with steady hands. You know how men are? Probably went fishing and lost track of time. But inside, I was counting hours. 72 of them. Enough time for Tony and his crew to show Mr. Anthony what helplessness felt like, what fear tasted like, what it meant to be at the mercy of someone stronger and crueler than yourself. On Monday evening, there was a knock at our door. Not the tentative rap of a neighbor or the firm knock of authority, but something in between. When Joe opened it, we found my grandfather standing on our porch, but it wasn't the same man who'd left on Friday morning. This version of Mr. Anthony was hollow-eyed and shaking. His clothes were torn and dirty. His hands trembled as he tried to light a cigarette, dropping it twice before managing to get it to his lips. Evening, Joe said carefully. We heard you'd gone missing. My grandfather's eyes darted between us, and I saw something in them I'd never seen before. Fear. Pure animal terror. I need to talk to Mary Ellen. He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm right here. He looked at me, and I watched him struggle to find words. Finally, I'm sorry. 2 words. After a lifetime of cruelty of control, of taking what he wanted without regard for the cost to others, he'd been reduced to 2 words. Sorry for what, Grandpa. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then, for your girl, for what I tried to do. And what did you try to do? You know? He couldn't meet my eyes. You know what I came here for that night. Say it. I can't. Say it or get off my porch. He broke, then tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. I came to hurt you, to take your baby away, to make you... He stopped, shoulders shaking. God forgive me, I came to make you just like me, empty, bitter, alone. And now I know what it feels like. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of 3 days spent learning lessons he'd taught others for decades. I know what it's like to be small, to be afraid, to be at someone else's mercy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. When he unfolded it, I saw Anna Marie's footprints, the ones they'd taken at the hospital before. "I went to see her," he said. "At the cemetery, brought her flowers, asked her to forgive a stupid old man who didn't know love when he saw it." I took the paper with hands that only shook a little. "What else?" "I'm leaving Nashville tonight. Got a job lined up in Memphis, construction work. I won't bother you again. Won't bother anyone again." "Good." He turned to go, then stopped. "They said to tell you, the men who taught me about consequences. They said to tell you it was paid in full, every last bit of it." After he left Joe and I sat in our living room holding each other in the silence. Justice had been served. Not the clean legal kind, but the messy human kind that actually meant something. "Do you regret it?" Joe asked eventually. I thought about Anna Marie, about the needle that would have ended her life, about the years of fear and control and stolen dreams. "No," I said. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it." Mr. Anthony kept his word. He left Nashville that night and never returned. We heard years later that he'd died in Memphis, alone in a boarding house with no one to claim his body. The man who'd terrorized his family for decades died as he'd lived his final years isolated, afraid, and forgotten. But from our tragedy came something unexpected, something beautiful. Unable to have more children due to the trauma of that night, I threw myself into healing others. I went back to school, earned my GED, then my bachelor's degree in psychology. Joe supported me through every late night of studying, every exam, every moment of doubt. I specialized in maternal grief, helping women who'd lost children find ways to transform their pain into purpose. I opened a practice, then expanded it, started support groups, wrote books, spoke at conferences. The Anna Marie Carter Foundation became my life's work, providing comprehensive support to mothers dealing with loss trauma and violence. We offered everything I'd needed and didn't have psychological counseling, legal advocacy, safe housing, and most importantly, the understanding that comes from shared experience. How do you do it?" other therapists would ask. "How do you hear these stories day after day without breaking?" "Because I've been where they are," I'd answer. "And I know it's possible to survive, to heal, to help others." Every woman I helped was a tribute to Anna Marie. Every life I touched was proof that her brief existence had meaning, that love, even love cut short, never truly dies. Now at 68, I visit Anna Marie's grave every year on her birthday. I bring flowers and photos of the women I've helped, the families I've reunited, the children who are alive today because their mothers found hope in the darkest moments. "Look what we built, baby girl," I tell her. "Look how many lives your short time here has touched." The mockingbird in the oak tree calls again, breaking me from my reverie. I struggle to my feet, my knees protesting the long kneeling, and brush the dirt from my hands. As I walk back to my car, I think about the young woman who'll be coming to see me tomorrow. Another Mary Ellen, in a way. Another woman whose dreams have been shattered by someone else's cruelty. Another mother who needs to learn that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that transformation is possible. I've spent 45 years proving that the darkest moments of our lives don't have to define us, that we can choose to let our pain serve others. That love, real love, creates ripples that spread far beyond what we can see. My grandfather thought he was ending something that night. Instead, he gave birth to a mission that has touched thousands of lives. He meant to create emptiness. Instead, he created purpose. Sometimes justice comes through the courts. Sometimes it comes through men like Tony Bighead and lessons taught in the shadows. But the truest justice comes from refusing to let evil have the last word. From taking our broken pieces and building something beautiful. That's the real story of Mary Ellen Carter. Not the victim of a violent man's cruelty, but the architect of hope for countless others. Not the girl who lost everything, but the woman who transformed loss into love. And in that transformation, Anna Marie lives on. not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Not as an ending, but as a beginning that stretches into forever. The years that followed were a slow rebuilding, like constructing a house brick by brick on ground that had been scorched by fire. Joe and I learned to live with the ghost of Anna Marie between us, not a haunting presence, but a gentle reminder of what we'd lost and what we still had to give. It was Mrs. Evelyn who first suggested I might have a gift for helping others. She'd been watching me at the accounting office, noting how other women gravitated toward me during their lunch breaks, sharing their troubles over lukewarm coffee and store-bought sandwiches. "There's something about you, Mary Ellen," she said one Thursday afternoon as we balanced the books for Morrison's Hardware. "Women trust you. They see something in your eyes that tells them you understand. Understand what? Pain. Loss. The kind of hurt that goes so deep it changes your bones." She set down her pencil and looked at me directly. "Have you ever thought about going back to school? Really learning how to help people?" The idea seemed impossible. I was 22, married to a fabric store clerk, with barely a fourth-grade education. But Mrs. Evelyn had a way of making the impossible seem merely difficult. "There's night classes at the community center," she continued. "Adult education. You could get your high school diploma, maybe even think about college eventually." Joe would be proud as punch," she interrupted. "That man loves you enough to want you to fly, not just survive." She was right, of course. When I broached the subject tentatively that evening, Joe's face lit up like I'd offered him the moon. "Mary, that's wonderful. When do you start?" "I haven't said I'm doing it yet. It would mean long nights, less time together, money we don't really have." "Money we'll find," he said firmly. "And as for time together, honey, watching you grow and learn would be time well spent." So began the longest decade of my life. Days at the accounting office, evenings in classroom 12B of the Fatherland Community Center, learning about algebra and American history and proper essay structure from Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher who volunteered her time to help adults chase dreams deferred. My classmates were a mixed group, veterans using the GI Bill, women like me, whose educations had been cut short by circumstance men who dropped out to work during the Depression and were finally getting their chance. We bonded over shared struggle and mutual encouragement. "You're going to be something special," said Dorothy Washington, a 40-year-old black woman who cleaned offices at night and studied during her lunch breaks. "Mark my words, Mary Ellen Carter. You got the kind of strength that builds bridges." Dorothy became more than a classmate. She became family. Her own story was a testament to resilience, widowed young when her husband died in Korea, raising 3 children on a cleaning woman's wages, while somehow managing to keep her dreams alive. She wanted to be a nurse, and I knew she'd make it. "Well, what about you?" she asked one evening as we walked to the bus stop after a particularly difficult chemistry lesson. "What's your dream?" I'd never articulated it before, but somehow the words came easily. "I want to help women who've lost babies. I want to be there for them the way no one was there for me." Dorothy stopped walking and turned to face me. "Then you better get ready to work twice as hard as everyone else, because the world don't make it easy for women who want to heal other women." She was right. When I finally earned my high school diploma at 24, the guidance counselor at Nashville State looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "Psychology is a very demanding field, Mrs. Carter. Are you sure you wouldn't be better suited to something more traditional education, perhaps, or secretarial science?" "I want to study psychology," I repeated patiently. "Specifically, I'm interested in grief counseling and trauma therapy." He sighed and pulled out a thick folder. "Well, you'll need to take the entrance exam, and your grades will need to be exceptional. The psychology program only accepts 20 students per year." I studied like my life depended on it. Joe would find me at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by textbooks from the library, practicing vocabulary words and memorizing psychological theories. He'd bring me coffee and rub my shoulders without complaint. "Sometimes I wonder if you'd be happier with someone simpler," I said one particularly difficult night when developmental psychology was making my head spin. "Mary Ellen Carter." he said, kneeling beside my chair. I fell in love with your heart first, your mind second, and your stubborn determination third. Watching you chase this dream is like watching the sunrise. It gets more beautiful every day. I passed the entrance exam with the third highest score in the group. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the psychology department head, called me into her office during orientation week. Mrs. Carter, your entrance essay was quite compelling. You mentioned a personal experience with pregnancy loss. Are you certain you're prepared to work in a field that might trigger difficult memories? Dr. Hendricks. I said, choosing my words carefully. My difficult memories are exactly why I need to be in this field. I know what it feels like to lose a child and have nowhere to turn. I want to make sure other women have somewhere to turn. She studied me for a long moment. Very well, but I want you to understand, this program is rigorous. We don't make allowances for personal circumstances or emotional difficulties. If you can't handle the academic demands, I can handle them. College was everything the guidance counselor had warned me about and more. The younger students looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity, the older woman trying to prove something. The professors were demanding to the point of cruelty, especially with students they perceived as non-traditional. But I had advantages my younger classmates didn't. I'd lived through real trauma, real loss, real recovery. When we studied grief theory, I wasn't just memorizing stages. I was remembering the journey. When we discussed therapeutic techniques, I was thinking about what would have helped me during my darkest hours. My breakthrough came during my third year in Dr. Marcus Webb's advanced counseling practicum. We were required to conduct practice sessions with volunteer clients under supervision. My first client was a young woman named Susan Miller. Susan had lost her first baby to SIDS at 3 months old. She sat in the small counseling room in the psychology building clutching a tissue and speaking in a monotone that I recognized immediately. Everyone keeps telling me it wasn't my fault, she said. That these things just happen, that I'm young and can have other babies, but they don't understand. They don't understand that this baby was irreplaceable. I finished quietly. That having other children doesn't erase the one you lost. That guilt doesn't care about logic. Susan looked up at me, really looked at me for the first time since she'd entered the room. Yes, exactly. How did you... Because I've been where you are. I said, breaking every rule Dr. Webb had established about maintaining professional distance. I lost my daughter before she was born, Anna Marie. She would have been 12 years old now. What happened next changed everything. Susan began to cry. Not the careful, contained tears she'd been shedding, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from her soul. And as she cried, she began to talk, really talk, about her son Tommy, about the guilt, about the dreams that still haunted her, about the marriage that was cracking under the weight of grief. By the end of our session, Susan was sitting straighter, not healed. Healing takes time, but hopeful in a way she hadn't been when she walked in. When can I see you again? She asked. I'm just a student. I don't care. You're the first person who's understood. Please. Dr. Webb had been observing through the one-way mirror. When Susan left, he entered the counseling room looking troubled. Mrs. Carter, what you did in there? Sharing your personal experience? That goes against everything we teach about therapeutic boundaries. I know. It was also the most effective counseling session I've observed in 15 years of teaching. He sat down across from me. How did you know to do that? Because I know what it feels like to sit in that chair. To have people tell you they understand when they clearly don't. Sometimes people need to know they're not alone before they can believe they can heal. Dr. Webb became my mentor after that. He helped me develop what would eventually become the Carter method, a therapeutic approach that carefully balanced professional expertise with lived experience. It wasn't about therapists sharing their trauma stories, but about creating an atmosphere where clients felt truly understood. Word spread quietly through the psychology department. Professor Webb had a student who got remarkable results with grief cases. By my senior year, I was being asked to co-facilitate support groups and assist with research projects. My thesis project was a comprehensive study of therapeutic outcomes for mothers experiencing perinatal loss. I interviewed 60 women documenting their experiences with traditional therapy versus support groups led by women who had experienced similar losses. The results were striking. Women who worked with counselors who had personal experience with pregnancy or infant loss showed significantly better outcomes in terms of depression scores, relationship stability, and overall adjustment. This could change how we approach grief counseling, Dr. Webb said after reviewing my findings. Have you considered graduate school? I'm 28 years old with a husband who's already supported me through 4 years of undergraduate study. I think it's time I started contributing financially again. Mary Ellen? He said seriously, you have a gift. Don't waste it because you think you're too old or because you feel guilty about your husband's sacrifices. The field needs people like you. But life had other plans. Just as I was considering Dr. Webb's suggestion, Joe came home from work with news that would change everything. Morrison's is closing, he said, setting his lunch pail on the kitchen counter with unusual force. Old man Morrison's selling to a chain store. They don't need all the current employees. Oh, Joe, I'm so sorry. There's more. He sat down heavily at our small table. My mother's sick. Cancer. She needs someone to take care of her, and I'm all she's got. Joe's mother, Elena, lived in a small town called Centerville, about 90 miles south of Nashville. She'd been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and given 6 months to live. We have to go, I said without hesitation. Family comes first. But your career, your plans? We'll wait. Elena raised you to be the man I fell in love with. Now it's our turn to take care of her. So we packed up our little house in Berry Hill and moved to Centerville, a town of 3,000 people where everybody knew everybody else's business, and newcomers were viewed with polite suspicion. Elena Carter was a tiny woman with steel gray hair and her son's gentle eyes. The cancer was aggressive, but she faced it with the kind of quiet dignity that made me understand where Joe got his strength. And I'm not afraid of dying, she told me during one of our long afternoons together while Joe looked for work in town. I'm afraid of leaving Joe alone in the world. He's not alone. He has me. Yes, but what happens when you have your own children? When your own family becomes the priority? I'd never told Joe's mother about Anna Marie. It seemed too heavy a burden to place on a dying woman. But looking at her that day, I realized she needed to know that Joe and I were a complete family, just the two of us. I told her everything about the pregnancy, the loss, the infertility that followed, about how Joe and I had built our marriage around supporting each other's dreams rather than traditional expectations of children and grandchildren. When I finished, Elena was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "That explains it." Explains what? Why you both seem older than your years. Why you look at each other like you've survived something together. She reached over and took my hand. I'm sorry for your loss, Mary Ellen. But I'm grateful it brought you and Joe closer instead of driving you apart. Elena lived for 8 months instead of 6, long enough to see Joe find steady work at the local lumber mill, and long enough to witness my first unofficial counseling session in Centerville. It started with Brenda Caldwell, the young woman who cleaned Elena's house twice a week. Brenda had lost her second baby to a miscarriage at 5 months and was struggling with depression and guilt. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she said one afternoon as we prepared lunch together. But you got a way of listening that makes it easy to talk. Tell me about your baby, I said simply. Jennifer. We were going to call her Jennifer Rose after my grandmother. Brenda's voice broke. Everyone says I should be grateful I already have one healthy child. That I should count my blessings instead of mourning what I lost. Jennifer Rose was a blessing too, I said. Just because her life was short doesn't mean it didn't matter. That afternoon turned into many afternoons. Brenda began bringing her sister-in-law who'd had 3 miscarriages. The sister-in-law brought her neighbor who'd lost a baby to a birth defect. Within 6 months, I was running an informal support group in Elena's living room every Tuesday evening. You need to make this official, Joe said one evening after the last woman had left. Get licensed as a counselor, charge a fee. turn this into a real practice. In Centerville, Joe, this town has one doctor, one lawyer, and a part-time preacher. They're not exactly ready for professional grief counseling. Then we go back to Nashville. Mom's gone now, and you've got work to do. Elena had died peacefully in her sleep on a cold February morning, with Joe and me holding her hands. Her last words were, "Take care of each other. And Mary Ellen, don't waste your gift." We buried her in the Centerville cemetery and packed up the little house she'd left to Joe. But instead of returning to Nashville immediately, we made a decision that would define the next phase of our lives. What if we stayed?" I said as we sorted through Elena's belongings. "What if we turned this house into a counseling center, served the women in small towns who don't have access to mental health services?" Joe looked around the modest living room where I'd been holding my support groups. "It would be a hard life, Mary. Small town practice, limited income, probably a lot of resistance from people who think therapy is for crazy people. But think about the need, Joe. These women are suffering in silence because they don't have anywhere else to go. We could reach people who would never make it to a big city practice." That's how the Carter Counseling Center was born. We converted Elena's front parlor into an office, installed a separate entrance, and hung out a simple wooden sign. I obtained my counseling license through a supervised practice arrangement with Dr. Webb, who drove down from Nashville once a month to provide oversight. The first months were lean. Small town suspicion of outsiders ran deep, and many people viewed therapy as an admission of weakness or craziness. But slowly, word spread. Women who had attended my informal support groups began referring friends and family members. Dr. Morrison, the town's only physician, started sending patients who were struggling with depression or anxiety. My breakthrough case came in the spring of 1979. Margaret Ann Sullivan was the wife of Centerville's mayor, a woman who seemed to have everything: beautiful home, successful husband, 2 healthy children. But she'd been battling severe depression since the stillbirth of her 3rd child 2 years earlier. "I can't talk to anyone in town," she said during our first session. "People expect me to be the perfect mayor's wife. They don't want to hear about my problems." Margaret Ann's treatment was complicated by the fact that her stillborn son had had severe genetic abnormalities, a fact the family had kept secret to avoid gossip and speculation. "I keep wondering if it was something I did," she confided. "Something I ate or didn't eat, or some medication I took. The not knowing is driving me crazy." "The not knowing is one of the hardest parts of any pregnancy loss," I told her. "Our minds want to find a reason, someone to blame, some way to make sense of senseless loss." Over months of therapy, Margaret Ann began to heal. She started a grief support group at her church. She became an advocate for better prenatal care in rural communities. Most importantly, she learned to carry her grief without letting it carry her. Word of Margaret Ann's transformation spread through Centerville's social circles. If therapy was good enough for the mayor's wife, it was good enough for everyone else. By 1980, I had a waiting list. But it was a case that same year that taught me the most important lesson of my career. Cheryl Lynn Hendricks was 19 years old, unmarried, and pregnant. In 1980, Centerville, that combination made her a social pariah. When she miscarried at 7 months, many people saw it as divine judgment. "Maybe it's for the best," her own mother said during our first family session. "You're young, unmarried. This way you can start fresh, make better choices." The cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. I thought of my own grandfather, of the choice he'd tried to force on me, of the way society could turn a woman's tragedy into a moral lesson. "Mrs. Hendricks," I said carefully, "your daughter has just lost a child she loved and wanted. Whether that child was born within marriage or outside, it doesn't change the reality of her grief. But surely you can see—" "I can see a young woman who needs support, not judgment. A daughter who needs her mother's love, not her mother's condemnation." That confrontation cost me some clients. Several families pulled their loved ones out of my practice, declaring that I was too liberal for their values. But it also taught me something crucial about the kind of therapist I wanted to be. I wasn't just treating grief. I was fighting the systems and attitudes that made grief harder to bear. I was challenging a culture that ranked some losses as more worthy of mourning than others. Dr. Webb noticed the change when he visited for supervision that month. "You're developing a reputation," he said over coffee in Elena's old kitchen, which we'd converted into a break room. "Word is getting back to Nashville that there's a therapist in Centerville who doesn't pull punches." "Is that good or bad?" "It's necessary. Too many therapists get so focused on maintaining neutrality that they forget to advocate for their clients." He paused. "Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you." The proposition was ambitious. Dr. Webb wanted me to develop a training program for rural counselors, teaching them specialized techniques for working with pregnancy and infant loss in communities where such topics were heavily stigmatized. "We get referrals from all over Tennessee," he explained. "Small towns where there's no mental health services, where women are suffering in silence because they don't have anywhere to turn. You could train local counselors, ministers, even physicians to provide basic grief support." The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. "I don't know if I'm qualified." "Mary Ellen, you've developed techniques that are getting results other therapists only dream of. You've learned to work within conservative communities without compromising your principles. And you understand rural dynamics in a way most academically trained therapists never will." The training program launched in 1981. Once a month, I would travel to different small towns across Tennessee, conducting weekend workshops for local helping professionals. We covered everything from basic grief counseling techniques to navigating family dynamics that complicated the healing process. But it was during one of these workshops in Cookeville that I encountered a case that would haunt me for years and ultimately lead to the most important discovery of my career. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a young physician who attended my workshop reluctantly sent by the hospital administrator, who was concerned about rising suicide rates among women of childbearing age. "I don't really believe in all this psychological stuff," she admitted during our lunch break. "In medical school, they taught us that grief is a temporary condition that resolves itself with time." "And what's your experience been with grieving mothers?" "Honestly, they make me uncomfortable. I deliver babies, I save lives. When I can't save a baby, I feel like I've failed. I just want the mothers to move on so I don't have to deal with my own feelings of inadequacy." Her honesty was refreshing, if troubling. "Tell me about a specific case." Dr. Martinez described a patient named Linda Foster, whose baby had died during delivery due to complications the doctor couldn't prevent. Linda had been coming to follow-up appointments for 6 months, asking the same questions over and over. What went wrong? Could it have been prevented? Was it her fault? "I've explained the medical facts dozens of times," Dr. Martinez said. "But she keeps coming back asking the same questions. It's like she can't hear what I'm saying." She's not looking for medical facts, I realized. She's looking for permission to stop blaming herself. She needs to hear from you, the person she trusted to deliver her baby safely, that she's not responsible for what happened. "But I've told her that." "You've told her medically she's not responsible. You haven't told her emotionally she's not responsible. There's a difference." I arranged to meet with Linda Foster the following week. She was a small, nervous woman who spoke in whispers and jumped at sudden sounds. Classic symptoms of trauma layered over profound grief. "Dr. Martinez says you might be able to help me understand what happened to Michael," she said, referring to her lost son. "What would help you understand?" "I need to know if there was something I could have done differently. Some sign I missed. Some way I failed him." We spent 3 hours together that day, not talking about medical facts, but about Linda's experience of pregnancy, her dreams for her son, her moment-by-moment memories of the labor that ended in tragedy. Finally, she asked the question that was really haunting her. "Do you think Michael knew I loved him?" "Linda," I said gently, "you carried Michael for 9 months. You talked to him, sang to him, dreamed about his future. You went through hours of labor trying to bring him safely into the world. Love like that doesn't go unnoticed, even by someone who never got to speak it back to you." For the first time since I'd met her, Linda cried. Not the careful, controlled tears of someone trying to hold it together, but the deep, cleansing sobs of someone finally allowing herself to grieve. When Dr. Martinez called me a month later, her voice was full of wonder. I don't know what you did with Linda Foster, but she's like a different person. She's back at work, taking care of her other children, even talking about maybe trying to get pregnant again someday. What changed? She stopped asking what went wrong and started talking about what went right. About how much she loved being pregnant, how much Michael meant to her, even though he didn't survive. It's like she gave herself permission to remember the good parts instead of just focusing on the tragedy. That conversation sparked an idea that would revolutionize my approach to grief counseling. What if the goal wasn't to help people get over their losses, but to help them integrate those losses into a meaningful life story? I began developing what I called legacy therapy, a technique that focused on helping grieving parents identify the positive impact their lost children had on their lives and the lives of others. Instead of viewing the pregnancy or brief life as a tragic mistake, we worked to find meaning and purpose in the experience. The results were remarkable. Parents who had been stuck in cycles of guilt and despair began to find ways to honor their children's memories through volunteer work advocacy, or simply by becoming more compassionate people. By 1985, I was being invited to speak at conferences across the Southeast. The Carter method, as it was becoming known, was gaining recognition as an innovative approach to grief therapy. But success came with unexpected complications.